Hey there, and welcome to U Talk. We highlight stories from across Canada, the diverse cultures and communities living here, and individuals and organizations that help make life the best it can be. I'm your host, Ryan Funk. I believe science is one of the coolest things ever, and it's incredibly inspiring to see people enter the fields of STEM. However, for the general public, there can often be a challenge to interpret and understand the in-depth work scientists go through. Cody Lo is an Ophthalmology Resident Physician at the Ottawa Hospital. Cody obtained his Doctor of Medicine and Bachelor's of Science majoring in Pharmacology from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and graduated as a Wesbrook Scholar. Cody and I discuss his passion about scientific research, advocating against health inequities, and helping mentor the next generation of leaders in his community.
My name is Cody Lo. I am a resident physician training to specialize in ophthalmology at the University of Ottawa. Previous to this, I completed medical school and I received a Bachelor's of Science in Pharmacology from UBC. And so in addition to my medical training, I've been quite involved in academic research, specifically in the areas of pharmacogenomics, which was somewhat related to what my undergraduate degree is in, and is the study of how our genes and genetics influences how we respond to drugs, and to try to use that information to prescribe medications better. And I also do a number of research projects related to ophthalmology, so related to eye disease and how we can treat eye disease better. And for folks with eye disease, how can we manage their condition so that they're able to see better and to ultimately live a better quality of life? In addition to all those things, I really enjoy science communication as well as community advocacy. I've been involved in a number of initiatives trying to help make science a little bit more accessible to the public. And that's a part of my work that I really enjoy as well.
And we'll definitely chat a little bit about that. But let's just start. What first attracted you to study medical science?
I think for me, the interest really goes back to when I was in high school. I think I was naturally drawn to the sciences and math. I really enjoyed that you can search for the answer and that there is a right answer and that you can problem solve, and that the problems that you solve can oftentimes have really tangible impacts on improving the lives of others. And when I transitioned from high school into university, I knew that I wanted to pursue a degree in science, but exactly what I wanted my career to look like, I think was a little bit still up in the air. Naturally, I knew that medicine was an option and was certainly an area that interests me, but I wasn't dead set on it at that point, to be honest. I also had an interest in research. I thought working at a pharmaceutical company would be really interesting. Trying to design experiments to discover new drugs and medications was something that really interested me as well. And so I think I spent a large portion of my undergraduate degree trying to parse that out. And I think ultimately what became the deciding factor was that I knew that I really enjoyed solving problems, and that was something that the medical sciences really offered me. But I think what drew me to medicine specifically was just the ability to interact on a really personal level with sort of the end users, being the patients, and being able to see in a really direct way how your skills and the things that you can offer can really make a direct impact on people at the end of the day. And I think that was something that was really apparent to me in medicine, which I think, while still possible, is not always as tangible as it is if you're working in a research lab or if you're working in a pharmaceutical company. Sometimes you don't always get that direct personal interaction, which is something that I really enjoy, and I think was what inspired me to pursue medicine.
That's something I've heard from a lot of people in the STEM fields, that they're problem solvers. They like seeing a puzzle and trying to put all the pieces together to find a solution.
Yeah, I think that's certainly something that really drew me to the field, and I think a lot of my colleagues, I can totally see them saying the same thing, because I do find it to be really rewarding to try to identify a problem in with a patient, or even in your community or in society as a whole, and trying to tinker with the problem and try to develop a better solution than what exists today.
And I mean, it's very interesting, just noble. Maybe you don't see yourself as that, but it's a very noble kind of pursuit of the sciences. I know for myself, when I was thinking about what kind of career I wanted to go in, I was thinking about paleontology, but mostly just because I think dinosaurs are cool.
It's interesting. Like I do find medicine to be really cool. How oftentimes you can predict what's going to happen with the patient, even though the patient may not necessarily see it yet, and that you're able to intervene and change that course. I find to be really cool. But at the same time, I do find it pretty fulfilling that oftentimes a problem that you solve or a diagnosis that you make can really change the trajectory of someone's life. So yeah, I would say it's a little bit of a mix of both.
Would you consider yourself a people person then?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a part of my career that I find to be very stimulating. Being able to talk to people, and I think that's something that really drew me to medicine. Is I think you get to interact with people day in and day out that especially come from all different backgrounds, which I think is something that's really unique to medicine. On one day or one aspect of my day, I can be talking to other medical professionals and other researchers about a project that we're working on. But that same day, I can be speaking to a patient that comes from low socioeconomic status, that comes from a very marginalized community, and get to speak with them about some of the challenges that they're having. And so I really like that you get to interact with the full gamut of society, which I think is something that's pretty unique being a physician that you don't necessarily always get to experience being in other careers.
So you have a very broad perspective when it comes to medicine. Physician, you want to study and research and be kind of that conduit between science and the public, and also ophthalmology. Why ophthalmology? What is it about that stood out to you?
That's a really good point, because ophthalmology is a very specific field of medicine. It's specifically related to the eye and eye surgery, which I think even amongst many physicians, they find it to be a very specific interest. And so I think my decision to ultimately decide to specialize in ophthalmology came around probably some way midway during my medical school career. I think it certainly wasn't a specialty that I was planning on coming into medical school. But I think that's one of the challenges of medical school is that during your 4 years, which may seem like a long time to many people, but I think to learn the breadth of all these different medical specialties oftentimes doesn't feel that long. And one of the challenges is to learn about all these specialties, not only the conditions that they treat, but I think also what the practice as that particular specialist looks like, whether you like practicing in a hospital or whether you prefer a clinic, whether you like the operating room, things of that nature. And so I think that's one of the things I tried to do during my first couple of years of medical school was develop some criteria that were really important to me in terms of selecting a specialty, and try to explore the different specialties to see which specialty kind of hit all those different criteria. And so late in my second year, I had a chance opportunity to shadow an ophthalmologist in the operating room. And it was there that I got to see cataract surgery for the first time. And this is a very common procedure that ophthalmologists do, where basically they remove the lens in the front of the eye, because when you get older, it starts to get a little bit cloudy and can make it difficult to see. And so ophthalmologists do a very short procedure. It takes around 20 minutes, and they replace that lens with an artificial lens. And one of the things that I found so amazing about this procedure is that patients can come in that morning having very poor vision that's impacting their ability to drive, to see their kids, and to just live their daily life. And after this short procedure, and typically they go home the night of, they see completely differently. And I think that was just such an amazing gift that as a physician, you're able to provide to a patient. And so I really liked how big of an impact that procedure can have on someone's life. And so that initially piqued my interest, and I ended up shadowing the same ophthalmologist in his clinic. And what I realized there was one of the high priority factors for me in choosing a specialty was that I'd be able to develop relationships with my patients. As we kind of alluded to earlier in the podcast, I consider myself a people person, and that's what I enjoy as part of my profession. And so it was seeing in clinic that I realized that many of the conditions that people have with their eyes are oftentimes chronic. And so that means that patients need to see their ophthalmologist every couple of months, oftentimes for years on end. And as a consequence of that, you get to know your ophthalmologist quite well. The ophthalmologist gets to know you quite well in terms of your circumstance, what's important to you, your family. They get to follow you through into your retirement oftentimes. And so I really like that as an ophthalmologist, you get to still develop those long-term relationships with patients, getting to know them and their families. But also, I think you have a lot of opportunities to do really impactful procedures and treatments that can really change people's lives. And so even though ophthalmology is a very specific field of medicine that I'll be practicing, I also want to make it a priority to not lose a sense of what it means to be a physician broadly. Because I think even though you specialize in a very particular disease or condition, I think your responsibility as a physician sort of transcends necessarily what you specialize in.
That's super cool. Yeah, just thinking about that relationship. For a lot of people, they don't, necessarily think about that. Just, oh, it's just my doctor, I go to see them. But yeah, you really can build almost sort of a kinship with people over their lifetime.
Yeah, I think it's something that after I got interested in ophthalmology, I kind of thought back to my childhood, and I saw an ophthalmologist as a kid for a brief amount of time. And thinking back on that time, it was pretty cool because I remember when something goes wrong with your eye, you get pretty scared because oftentimes you don't really know what's going on, you can't see well, and so I think the potential for an ophthalmologist to kind of help you navigate whatever might be going on, to help treat that, and I think there's a real opportunity there to develop some close relationships with patients.
Even though we've just been talking for a short amount of time, I can sense that passion in you and that drive to learn and help others in their life. During your medical career, as a visible minority, did you feel like you had to prove to yourself throughout your studies? Did you feel like you had to try harder or do more than others?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess first off, I can start out by just saying that I think in higher education broadly, and I think in medicine, I think I would consider pretty progressive in terms of trying to be inclusive of different minorities and people that come from different backgrounds. But certainly, I do think that there are a number of systemic barriers that still remain in terms of even just being admitted into university or to even becoming a physician. I think there are still some systemic barriers that there's room for improvement. And even in medicine, in terms of certain ethnic groups that I think are not always treated the same. So certainly there are ways that we can improve. And I do think there have been situations in the past where I've been the minority in the room. And I can remember the feeling of discomfort in those situations and how it can oftentimes shape how you feel about yourself and what your capabilities are and what your potential is. And so from those situations, I think I've tried to remember those feelings that I felt, because at the same time, I also recognize the privilege that I have in that I think many of my peers and the patients that I interact with face many of these feelings and these situations much more frequently and to a much greater extent than I often do. And so there have been times where I felt like I've had to work a little bit harder to get the same treatment as maybe someone else, or that I've had to work a little bit harder and to push a little bit harder to just be sort of on a level playing field as someone else. And, I think instead of seeing that as a downside or something that is lacking in myself, I think I've really tried to view it as a strength that I bring to the profession. And I think one example that I can bring up is that the majority of my family is Chinese in ethnicity. And so we celebrate Lunar New Year. And I was doing a rotation on the general medicine service at a hospital. And on that particular team, I just so happened to be the only person on that team that celebrated Lunar New Year. And on Lunar New Year itself, we had a couple of patients that we were treating that were also Chinese. And so because of my family's experience celebrating this holiday, I was aware that it was today. And, that for many folks, this is not a day that you necessarily want to be in the hospital not feeling well. And so I made an effort to see those patients that day and to wish them a happy new year and to just try to offer them some well wishes for that holiday. And I think those patients really appreciated the gesture. And I do think it helped them develop a trust in our team as a whole, not just me specifically, and that we had their best interest in mind and that we saw them as a person as opposed to just another patient that we were treating for the day. And so I think that's just an example of a time that I was able to leverage maybe something that in other circumstances was seen or being a minority and that came with challenges, and that I was able to instead use that as an opportunity to help me be better at my profession and to ultimately help our team develop a better end product in terms of the care we were able to provide to those folks.
Regardless of the situation, it's never, or environment, it's never bad to have more diversity. Much like representation in the media, when a patient sees a doctor who looks like them, not only does it, help them have like a sense of just calmness, or like, oh, this is someone who can see me and understand me, but also that different perspective, especially in the medical field, like that can't be overstated, just having different mindsets to how to solve a problem.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think it's such a powerful thing. I think especially for patients who have maybe newly immigrated to this country, and I think already feel a bit uncomfortable coming to the hospital, to just have a physician or someone taking care of them that looks like them and speaks their language or is able to relate to them, I think can really help patients feel a bit more comfortable. And so, yeah, I think certainly that's a huge reason, I think, why we should be promoting folks from all different backgrounds, all different races, from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, sexual orientations, to be part of medicine, because I think that's such a powerful thing. And I think the other thing that I'll add to that is, I think increasingly amongst just my colleagues, I think as I move throughout my training and I have a larger voice to sort of advocate for these things, I do think there's value in sort of helping the folks that are coming up behind you that maybe come from different backgrounds, into helping elevate them and to just feel welcomed in the profession as well. Because I think even within the profession, if you come from a bit of a different background than some of your peers, I think there's a lot of hidden challenges in being able to progress through your training.
You're also an advocate for just science in general and that bridge between scientific professionals and the general public. Why is it important to kind of bridge that divide? And what inspired you to be a voice?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to try to bridge that divide between science and the general public, because I've been very fortunate to have received the training to design and interpret scientific studies. And I think that's enabled me to try to understand various complex topics. And so I recognize that in many cases, scientific research is complicated. The studies that we run to develop new medications are complicated stuff. But unfortunately, many patients who have certain diseases have a vested interest in trying to decide whether or not they should go for surgery, or is this a good medication for them to take. And so I think without that training, it can be really challenging to try to understand like what choices you should be making, even about your own healthcare. And so I think as a physician, I think there's a huge responsibility to try to help patients sort of translate that complicated information in a way that can make sense to them and that enables them to feel empowered to make a decision. And I think an interesting trend that I've seen even in my own medical practice is that I think information nowadays is so much more accessible, that oftentimes patients are coming to their physician already having read up about their diagnosis, already having maybe read a few scientific studies about different medications or different herbal supplements and things like that. And so, I think the relationship between a physician and patient is oftentimes becoming very bi-directional, in the sense that patients will bring you information that they've seen or that they've acquired from other sources, and you're sort of helping them translate that information and making sure that they're interpreting it in the right way, and so that ultimately they're able to make a decision that they can be comfortable with. And so I think that was a huge inspiration for why I try to make that part of my career in terms of communicating science to the general public, because I think in many cases, folks are pretty interested in a lot of these topics. I think this has just been sort of exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think we've really seen folks from all different walks of life become very interested in all the latest studies related to COVID and vaccines and things of that nature, which I think just really highlights the role for people with sound scientific training to help dispel some of the not so great information that is out there sometimes, and to just making sure that folks are interpreting this information in a way that's responsible.
You can hear about some stories online of how people come like, oh, here's all these papers and things, but they misinterpret the data. And like they think like, oh, I know more than my doctor now. I don't have to listen to this. Like, no. Yeah. Listen to your physician. They know what's going on.
Yeah, it can be challenging at times. And, I think not like these things are complicated. And, I think it's totally reasonable that sometimes people don't necessarily interpret things the right way. I think it's problematic when people are intentionally sort of misleading folks around certain things. And so, yeah, like I think this is unfortunately such a common thing nowadays. And so hopefully we can do some good in trying to dispel some of those things.
Because I know for myself, and I have a friend who's now going to school for sciences, man, reading some of those like scientific studies and papers can be a bit overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I think something I even try to tell patients too is like at this point, I've done like 8 years of university, and I still sometimes don't always understand what a paper is trying to say on the first read. And so there's like no expectation that someone who doesn't have like university training in sciences is going to be able to interpret some of this stuff. And so, I think it can be very humbling in a lot of ways. And that's something I try to convey to people that I talk about this with, that it's complicated stuff. And I think people, even professionals, don't always get it right.
What sort of advice would you give someone to approach reading a scientific paper?
I think some practical tips that I can offer is that, I think oftentimes headlines and news articles that try to interpret scientific studies obviously have the motivation of, trying to convey the main point in a way that is exciting and that will get you to click on the article and to read it through to its completion. And so I think the first thing that I'd recommend for people that see those sorts of headlines and news articles is to try to take a look at the actual scientific article. And I think when you're reading through some of these articles, I think the methods section is oftentimes a really great place to find out where people may be misinterpreting some of these studies. Because I think oftentimes some of the studies that make the most sort of exciting claims that you'll see in the media are oftentimes exciting because these are things that we're finding out in non-human models. So whether it be in like cells in a petri dish or being done in animals, I think trying to figure out what experiment they did and in what sort of model they did that experiment in, I think is a really great way to sort of screen how far something is from being potentially applicable to humans. Because I think when an experiment shows something really exciting in a mouse, that's oftentimes still quite a ways away from being something that you'll see in the clinic or that your doctor will prescribe to you. And I think the other thing too is looking at, if you can, sort of the figures in the paper and trying to see sort of what is the size of the difference or the effect that people are claiming. I think many times, especially in pharmacology, in drug research, the size of the effect of a medication, even though a news article may be saying that it decreases your rate of heart attack or whatever it is, oftentimes when you actually look at the data and you look at the figure, it shows that, maybe your risk of heart attack decreases by 1% over 10 years or whatever it is. And, I think some of that interpretation that a physician does is partially trying to interpret like what is actually important. I think in some cases I would argue that, taking a new medication that comes with side effects and that may cause harm to you, is that really worth, decreasing your risk of a heart attack by 1% over 10 years? I think it's questions like that I think a physician is really helpful in trying to interpret for a patient. And that isn't always obvious when you just kind of read through a scientific paper that is obviously trying to, make a point about this discovery that they made. And so that's something that I think folks who are reading these papers can try to do.
You mentioned headlines in the media. Do you think there should be maybe a better collaboration between media outlets and scientists in terms of sharing this information? Because a lot of times, you'll see those kind of glorified or just bedazzled headlines.
Yeah.
Out there.
Yeah, it's a really challenging thing. I appreciate that media organizations and things of the like have their own motivations, and they need to, write an enticing story to get people to read the article. And, I do recognize that, some of the challenges, both for myself and many other researchers who do media interviews and things like that, is that, oftentimes there's this frustration that you'll do a media interview and you're super careful about everything that you said, and you're very mindful to not overstate what the results were during your interview. And then you'll read the article after and perhaps you're misquoted or, the article is just not representative of what you said. And while that can certainly be frustrating at times, I do recognize that there's a lot of competing interests in this. And so, while I think it's important that we try to be as mindful as researchers or as physicians in terms of what we say to the media, I think one of the values of having physicians and scientists, involved, there's many researchers nowadays that are very big on social media and that have social media followings. And so I think when you have folks like that that can, speak on the news and be very mindful about what they're saying, or on social media can, post things and with a very thoughtful commentary about things. I think that's one of the real values, is that, I think in some circumstances, while I think the media tries to get it right, I think there's a responsibility on physicians and researchers to try to get out there as well, to try to interpret some of these things.
On your website, it says you want to be a leader in medical science and community engagement. What about this is important to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is somewhat related to some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of physicians trying to play a leadership role in facilitating the public learning about health. And I think that oftentimes extends to your local community as well. Oftentimes, as a practicing physician, you are working in a particular community, and you get to meet folks from all around your local community and understand what's facing them from a health perspective and a societal perspective. And I think this was really apparent to me because I did part of my medical training in a small town in northern BC called Smithers, where there, I think particularly in a small town, the physicians play a much larger role as part of the community, because oftentimes there's only a handful of physicians in that particular community, and they see basically, everyone who lives in that particular town. And I think one of the things I noticed there is that physicians were very informed about, for example, when a not so good supply of drugs were going through the community. And when they noticed that, they advocated to the local government to increase supports for those particular folks who may be going through substance use issues. And so there I noticed how much of a role the physicians played in advocating for their local community, because they really had that sort of on the ground understanding of what some of their patients are facing. And I think even if you live in a bit of a larger city, I think some of those ideas and some of those themes still hold true, because even though there may be a lot more physicians where you're practicing, I do think that there's an opportunity, because you get to meet so many folks from all walks of life who are living in that particular community. I think there's a real opportunity to have an impact. For example, one of the family physicians that I worked with during medical school, who practices in a suburb of Vancouver, has taken a huge leadership role in helping with the COVID vaccine rollout. I was talking to her recently, and she was telling me about how, because she had an understanding of where all the senior homes were and which communities were being affected by COVID in terms of her patients that she was seeing getting positive tests, she was able to really help inform government officials and things of that nature how to best roll out the vaccine. And I think that's just such a great example of how, as a physician, you can really take a leadership role in your community. And I think you offer a really unique perspective that maybe some other folks who are traditionally making those decisions don't necessarily always have.
You build those relationships with people in your community, especially in smaller ones. They're your neighbors, they're friends you've known your whole life, and people look up to you. So yeah, you definitely have that voice and can be an advocate for things.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think as a physician, you oftentimes have a pretty unique skill set in terms of your understanding of disease and how disease spreads. I would recommend to my colleagues to not underscore sort of the impact that you can have on your community with that knowledge.
To kind of show my nerdiness, with great power comes great responsibility.
Exactly. I like it. They should have said that at my graduation.
You mentioned 8 years of university,
yes,
correct?
Yeah.
For someone who is first getting their steps or thinking about heading into medical science and medical school, what advice would you have for them? Because 8 years can be pretty daunting when you're just kind of starting at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, I'd like to highlight that even so, like I've done 8 years of university so far, but to become, for example, a specialist in ophthalmology or even other specialties, you oftentimes will end up doing 13 years of training post high school before you're independently in practice. So yeah, just to highlight, it's not an insignificant amount of time, and it's a long time to be in training. And so what sort of mindset or recommendations I'd have for a student who is maybe thinking about pursuing medicine, I think, is that medical training comes with challenges, and it's long and it can be tiring at times. And so I think an important part of your mindset is that I think you should firstly be motivated by learning Because I think when you're training for that long, and even once you're in practice, and even if you do research, I think you're always learning, and that needs to be something that really excites you. And so I think that's a pretty necessary prerequisite to enjoy what you do as a physician or as a researcher, is to be excited by the prospect of learning, even well into your career. And I think the other thing that I'd recommend in terms of mindset is that I think you should really, really be motivated by helping people. Because I think given how long the training is, and I think even once in practice, many physicians are not necessarily working a 9 to 5, 40-hour per week, no weekends type of job. I think if you're not motivated by helping people and giving, it can be a lot of sacrifices that you'll have to make. And so I think those would be a couple of the things that I'd recommend someone who's considering their career to really reflect on. Personally, I think those are things that really motivate me, and there's nothing else that I'd rather be doing. And so, the long training and the hours and things like that are not a concern to me. But, I recognize that people have different priorities in terms of, you may sacrifice time with your family. You may sacrifice time to do the hobbies that you enjoy or things that you like doing outside of necessarily work. And so, I just recommend to be real with yourself, to try to understand what excites you, what your priorities in life are. But I think if it's something that matches sort of your interest, I think it's a really great career.
So, are you doing any research right now? And if you are, what can you tell us about
For
it?
sure. I think the majority of my research nowadays is related to ophthalmology and eye disease. I can speak a little bit about one project that I'm working on. It's a project related to myopia, which is nearsightedness, which many people, perhaps listening to this podcast, may have. And so what people may not know is that from an ophthalmology perspective, how we view myopia is that it oftentimes means that your eye is a little bit too long for the focusing power of your eye. And for some folks who have really severe myopia, and this is probably not the case for many of the people listening because I don't want to scare people, is that when you have really severe myopia, your eye is actually so long that it can predispose you to some problems when you get a little bit older, particularly related to the retina, which is sort of the wallpaper at the back of your eye that helps transmit the light signals that you see to your brain. When your eye is that long and your retina sort of stays the same size, you can start getting issues with the retina being stretched, and it can tear. Sometimes when it's stretched that thin, it can start to degenerate at a bit of a faster pace than we would expect in sort of someone who doesn't have that issue. And so, unfortunately, what happens to these folks is when they get later in life, they oftentimes have these issues that really severely impacts their vision. And when you're already later in life and maybe have issues already getting around because you have arthritis or other issues, having poor vision can really predispose you to issues related to falls, or can impact your ability to drive or to just live independently. And so the research that I'm working on is looking at folks who have this really severe form of myopia. And when they get older and start to develop some of these consequences, how are they typically presenting to an eye care professional? Because one of the things that we're finding is that these folks, their retinas start having issues at a bit of an earlier age than we would expect in someone who doesn't have high myopia. And so many of these folks are not already connected to an ophthalmologist already. And so they're presenting quite late when their vision is already quite impaired. And that they oftentimes require quite unique needs in terms of special eyeglasses or tools like canes or magnifiers and things of that nature. And so the research that I'm working on is trying to understand amongst patients who present with these issues, how are they presenting? How bad is their vision? What supports do they need? And if the supports that we're giving them are actually helping them live a more productive and higher quality life. And so the hope from our project like this, is that once we have this sort of understanding, we can make some recommendations to our colleagues in the field that maybe these folks that have high myopia from when they get their glasses checked, maybe they should start being referred to an ophthalmologist at an earlier stage so that they can be followed for some of these consequences. And maybe when they start to develop some of these consequences, we can make some recommendations in terms of what tools and supports they'll need to help them live a higher quality life. And so that's one of the projects that I'm working right now that I'm optimistic will hopefully have some impact from some of the folks that are dealing with some of these issues.
Well, of course, yeah. When you're in those later stages of life, I have a grandfather who has eye issues. It's crazy how much of your independence just disappears once you can't see properly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of the values that an ophthalmologist brings, even though you're focusing on a very specific area of the body, is that having poor vision really impacts other aspects of your life. If you can't see well, you can't really get around, you can't exercise, which impacts your heart health. If you can't move around that well, you start developing osteoarthritis. And so, I think treating vision issues and treating it well, I think, can have a really big impact, especially for those folks who are later in life, like your grandfather.
For everyone listening, it can't be overstated the importance of talking to your physician, letting them know if you're noticing any problems or issues so that you can meet up with a specialist so that they can help, like Cody, help, prevent, maybe not prevent, but help stop these from escalating.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's such an important message. And I recognize that there's many groups of people, and even some of my friends and family tell me that maybe they haven't had the most positive impact with a physician in the past. And I think that's really unfortunate when it does happen. Seeing many of my colleagues, I think the future of medicine is bright. Many of the folks that I've interacted with are such caring individuals, and so yeah, I would definitely recommend that. Seeing a specialist early is really important. It's always really heartbreaking when you see someone who presents to hospital with a condition that, if they had presented a little bit earlier, would have had a really different outcome. And so I definitely recommend that to folks. Yeah, I think one of the challenges, especially for the general public accessing research and scientific papers, is that unfortunately many of them are published in journals that have subscriptions, and it can be challenging if you're not necessarily a student at university who has a library subscription to access some of those things. Some recommendations I can have is to even just find papers. I think Google Scholar is a really user-friendly interface. If you can use Google, you can use Google Scholar. And so I think that's a great first step for people who may have a specific topic that they'd like to look a little bit more into. I think in terms of finding articles that are oftentimes freely available, PubMed is a really good resource. It's produced by the National Institutes of Health in the US, and they have a really large library of papers, many of them free to access, that I think can be really helpful. And I think one of the exciting trends in medical publishing is that many publishers are increasingly moving towards open access, which means you no longer need a subscription to access papers. So publishers like Science Open or PLOS ONE are really good for that. And I think one of the secrets, or hidden secrets, of academic publishing is that oftentimes as a researcher, you don't get necessarily compensated for papers that you publish in a particular journal. And so what you can do sometimes is, if there's a paper that you're really interested in, but it's behind a paywall and you need to pay to access it, you can email the author of the paper that's usually listed on the paper itself. And the author has the right to distribute their publication to whoever they like. And as a researcher, we don't get any compensation from how many people read the article through the journal subscription or anything like that. And so I think we'd oftentimes be very touched and very flattered that someone is that interested in our work to reach out in that way. And so I think most folks would be very open to just sending you the paper free of charge. And so that's something that I've actually used a few times when I'm doing research and I have a hard time accessing a paper, is just reach out to the author. And I think it's just a little known secret to how to access some of these papers that are hard to find.
Because something I've learned is that researchers love to talk about their work.
Yep, that is very true. Because I think oftentimes we're researching such specific things that are only of interest to a very small handful of people around the world, that we get pretty excited when someone shows that interest.
So in summary, is there anything else that you would like to add, Cody?
I think I'd just like to add, I think in terms of medicine, I think it's such a great field, and I think the future of it is so bright in terms of moving towards inclusivity. So many of my colleagues, I think, do even more work than I do in advocating for folks from marginalized populations and things of that nature. And so I'm really optimistic about the future of the field. And, I think for someone who's listening to this that is thinking about joining the field, and that maybe comes from a background that they haven't necessarily seen reflected in the physicians that they've interacted with, whether it be from like a cultural background or things of that nature. I would just advocate that I think, the field is changing. I think there's a lot of efforts to try to make the field more inclusive. And I think many folks in the medical profession are very open to mentoring folks who maybe come from different backgrounds. And so I wouldn't let those sorts of barriers stop someone from thinking that they can do it, because I think the field needs people like that. And that I think people from different cultural backgrounds, for example, have so much to offer the field of medicine and research.
If you have any stories you'd like us to share or communities we should highlight, leave a comment on our social media or reach out to us on our website. I'm Ryan Funk. This was You Talk, and have yourself a good one.